I'm joined here on the Presilience Podcast by Mr. Ron Amram, Risk2 Solutions General Manager of Training and Education. Ron, it's great to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here, Joe. Chatting again.
Yeah, you and I have had obviously many conversations being colleagues, but it's also always nice to be able to talk with other people listening as well. Ron, as I mentioned, your role is in training and education. You run all our training and education initiatives. I know it's a topic that's very near and dear to your heart. It's something you're very passionate about, obviously very skilled with. I would like to just start off, for the sake of our listeners, a bit of an introduction to you. If you can talk about what your role is, but also how you got started in education and why you're so passionate about it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe. So I come from a family of educators, right? Both my mom and my dad were educators, as well as my sister. My dad has been kind of a pivotal figure in my transition into education, but I'd like to think in education in general. He passed away many years ago, but his approach to education was very much around finding the skills and gifts that young people have and nurturing those. So essentially, he ran programs that allow kids to discover what they're good at and what they like doing, and then nurture those talents into high school. Now, that was always balanced with the idea that if we're going to identify what gifts and abilities somebody have and invest, time and money and resources and help and emotional energy to help them grow, there should be reciprocation. In other words, the idea is that we train these people to give back to the community. So having a gift, it's the old Spider-Man quote, right? With great power comes great responsibility. That was pretty much it. So the reason I'm going on about that is because I really think it relates to Presilience in the context that his vision was very much about growing people who can see what the problems are, around them, whether it's their team, their organization, their community, the society, and use their gifts to proactively seek those out and fix them, right? Which is very much a forward-thinking approach. 30, 40 years ago, wasn't very popular or common in education. These days, it's a little bit more. So I grew up essentially in that school that he ran. So obviously education is something I've been exposed to from a very young age. I started teaching guitar when I was 15, started lecturing at university, at Edith County University here in WA in finance and professional communications when I was 21. I was there for about 10 years. I won a bunch of awards. And since then, I've consulted in the vet sector, also in training, in implementation of systems, in organizational culture, and a bunch of other stuff. And then, I've been with R2S for the last few years in the role that I am now. In addition, I'm also a lifelong martial arts coach, so very passionate about teaching and about imparting skills.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. And one of the things that you and I have talked about previously, personally, and I think it would be a really, really cool topic to explore for other people's benefit as well. You've had a lot of diverse training, coaching, teaching experience, from teaching something that's like creative endeavor, like teaching guitar, to a more physical endeavor with like martial arts, to purely academic endeavors at higher education, and then vocational endeavors through RTOs. So there really isn't much you haven't done from a teaching point of view. And I know you've taught all ages as well. So with that in mind, what are some of the things that you see that areas for improvement, things that perhaps non-professional educators could be doing better to affect real benefit and change for their students and participants?
Sure, that's a really good question. So at the core, I think that education and training, and we'll touch on the separation between those two in a second as well, but it's really about changing behavior, right? So when we are teaching somebody something, is because we want them to behave in a particular way or have the skills to do something that they don't have to do now. The question is often, to start with, have we identified the behavior or the needs of the client or the person we're teaching before we started looking at what we're delivering and how we're delivering it? Now, what I'd really like to do is, if we talk about that, let's say in the context of Presilience, right? So for listeners out there who may be not familiar with the Presilience maturity model, we stack that up in 3 levels, right? So we start with compliance, and compliance is very much the rules to the game that we play, as an organization, right? These are the minimum requirements that we have to do or we have to meet if we want to keep our organization running. And the problem with compliance is that it is backwards looking, right? Something has to go wrong many times and have significant enough consequences before we change the legislation or rule. So it's very much backwards looking. It's also not tied to performance, right? So it also tells us what is the bare minimum that we have to do to keep operating. So from compliance, we go to resilience. Now we're looking at once something has gone wrong and we recognize that things will go wrong, how do we fix them and get back to where we were before? That's great. Couple of problems, we're still looking backwards, right? So something breaks and then we fix it rather than trying to prevent something from breaking. And the other thing is, how do we know that where we were before was the best place to be? Maybe we should be in a different spot. Maybe we need to, to take a right, to go at an angle, rather than come back to where we were pre-disruption. From there, we go to presilience, which is, looking ahead and trying to prevent where possible, prepare for, respond, and recover from events with a balanced view of minimizing downside and capitalizing on opportunities. Now, if we relate that back to education, how we look at that, I think it actually provides a pretty good foundation to identifying needs, right? So what is the problem that I'm trying to solve, whether for the person or for the organization? If it's a compliance problem, okay, then the training needs to focus on, procedures, on, legislation, on standard operating procedures, whatever it is that will hopefully get people to understand what they can and can't do, all right? If we're then looking at resilience, well, have we given them the tools to repair something when it's broken? And that can be a system, it can be a person, it can be an incident, it can be performance issues, but have we given them the tools to actually fix it? And then if we look at presilience, is have we given them the ability to look around them, identify what are the indicators that something might break, and be proactive about fixing it or optimizing it or changing it, right? So I think when we keep that in mind, it really helps with identifying those needs and trying to contextualize the training or the education to what you're doing. That's one. A couple of other things, which are things that I'm personally a fan of, is number one is I'm really big fan of collaborative approaches, right? I don't like to be the person at the front of the room going blah, 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 do this, move to the next slide, blah, 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 do that. Yes, you need to establish your credibility. Yes, you need to be a subject matter expert when you are communicating, 100%. But if we want to get real change of behavior, it's got to be a collaborative approach. Me talking at somebody is, especially if you're talking about, 5 days in the classroom for 8 hours a day, is unlikely to impact or have a long-term change. So we need to work collaboratively with people to identify, how we can make their lives better and easier in order to affect that change. So the saying that I really like with, pardon me for that, is I'd rather be the guide on the side than the sage on the stage. And there may be times where one is required more than the other, but I'm very much a fan of the former.
Yeah, that's some really good points you raised there. And I think just coming back to that first thing you raised about knowing where you want to go, knowing what you're actually hoping to achieve, that is so important. And I think from my perspective, it's really important for organizations, for coaches, for leaders to be very, very clear about what they're trying to achieve and be honest about that. Not just what the mission statement says, but what are we actually trying to achieve? And one of the conversations that I have, especially when we're talking about security and safety and those very regulated environments, is, are you trying to achieve compliance or are you trying to achieve competence? Because those come at two different costs. And it's fine to say, no, I just need compliance. I literally just need to tick this box or else I can't continue to operate. And that is okay, provided you have a risk assessment that says, yeah, no, that's probably sufficient. But if you have a risk assessment that says, no, your staff actually need to know how to do this, they need to be competent at it and can do it without supervision, with a high degree of accuracy, then buying the compliance solution isn't going to get you that, because compliance can be achieved very quickly, usually cheaper, and it's a tick box activity. And we've all seen and probably all sat through the do it yourself, flick through a PowerPoint slide, click, yes, I completed, have a bit of a swag at the multiple choice questions at the end and say, yes, I've completed that training. Didn't make you any more competent than you were beforehand. right? That's fine in some spaces, provided you are honest about your needs. But if you're saying we are going to achieve competence, but we're only going to pay for, budget for, or give the opportunity for compliance, then you're misleading yourself and your organization. But I think that connects very tightly back to what you said about what are you actually trying to achieve. And if you know that, then maybe it's not feasible to do that in a half an hour. Maybe that half an hour block is better spent. Let's do half an hour every week on this particular topic. And then over the course of 6 months, we're actually going to see some behavioral change, which ties into nice pieces of learning psychology about be able to review things over and over, be able to reflect upon things, etc. So I think that's so critical. What you said: know where you're trying to go and be realistic about how long it's going to take to get there and what steps you can take to get there.
100%, Joe. And I think the other thing that you touch on as well, especially when we're talking about competence, when we're looking at changing behavior, it's the 1% changes that accumulate over time, right? So it's not like we're going to run somebody through an education program and tomorrow they're going to perform at 100%. It's got to be small. It's got to be consistent. And it's got to be digestible. So, if we sit somebody through 40 hours of training in a week where somebody talks at them, and then we expect them to go out and perform at that, that's also fairly unrealistic. One of the things that I'm a big fan of, which we see a lot in the context of, let's say, teaching martial arts or teaching in the vet sector, where it's a bit more applicable in terms of skill, like actual job skills, is that practical component, so to speak, where let's give you a little bit of theory and a little bit of knowledge, and then let's have you actually try and problem solve with that. Right? Because that's really the only way that you're going to learn. And, most people who will listen to it may have experienced what usually happens to graduates of university, right? Where you complete your bachelor degree. For example, I did one in business, and then you go out and you get a job and you realize that it's so different from what you've been told in your degree. It is half of this stuff doesn't make sense. It doesn't connect. The context is different. We know that theory and practice are very, very different. So it really is important to look at how we don't just educate, but train. And that's, I think, that distinction. When we look at training, we actually give people skills they can apply. And that's tied to what you said before. That takes time.
Yeah, agreed. You mentioned a differentiation there in language about how we're looking at things. I'm also curious to pick your brain about how we control the narrative around education, especially within the organizational context, because I feel like there is sometimes we undervalue education, and sometimes we set ourselves up for failure by talking about things like, oh, this is mandatory training, right? And of course, as soon as someone sees on their roster they have mandatory training, their heart sinks, because they are
100%.
like, I don't want to do that. That's not what I'm paid for. I don't have to do that. I've been doing this for 30 years. Why do I have to go and reset this thing I've seen?
My emails are going to pile up. I've got more important things to do.
You
Yeah.
immediately get defensive about it. And you and I know, as trainers, when you are delivering mandatory training, you can feel the energy in the room from the second people arrive. They don't want to do it. They don't want to be there. And a large part of that is actually the culture of the organization when it comes to what value do we place upon this training. Part of it's on the trainer as well, to make sure it's engaging and entertaining and something that's not painful to get through, because a lot of the time when you are doing mandatory annual training, you are telling people stuff they already know, right? And it's just to make sure that they still know it, and we are refreshing it. But then it's on the trainers to make sure that it's done in an engaging way that people don't dread.
Yeah. So can I touch on that for a sec, Joe? Sorry to interrupt, but so something that for me works really well with that, which is why I think I'm not a bad trainer, is that I came from, like I said, I played guitar from a young age. I studied the Western Australia Academy of Performing Arts. I've been a performer since I was quite young. I used to always, been gigging since I was 15 till I was about 30. And for me, doing a delivery, whether it was a lecture at university, a martial arts class, it's a performance. The idea is that I go in there and it's not just about the knowledge, it's about the experience. And I think that's really, really important, right? You want people to have that positive experience, that engagement, and that's all to do with the trainer, right? And that doesn't mean you have to be, crazy, outgoing, blah, blah, blah. We all have our own delivery style, but that's something that's really important to work on and hone as you get better, because the more entertaining, the more engaging you can make that, the more people are going to take out of it.
Yeah, and look at while our this isn't necessarily a plea to educators out there, do look into that. Like, it's not just about what you know; it's about how you can convey it. Much like you, I'm the same. Like, every time I teach, it is a performance, and if that's an 8-hour performance, that's why I get home after an 8-hour delivery and I am done. Like, there is nothing
Yeah, 100%.
because I'm on stage the entire time. And one of the things that I did several years ago was I actually started studying great speakers, not because of the content they had, but how they delivered it. I'd watch how they moved across stage. I'd watch what gestures they used. I'd watch where they positioned themselves. I'd watch what they would do when the energy started to dip. I'd watch what sort of techniques they use, like a call and response, or turn to the person next to you and give them a high five. Like those kinds of things that, like I would start taking notes on that because they're performance cues. They're not. It's not about you. That makes them a better subject matter expert. It's about making sure the audience is listening enough or with you enough that you can actually transmit that expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I've had really, really knowledgeable subject matter experts who are like really bad teachers. And I've had people who, probably didn't know much more than I did, who like blew my mind.
Yeah.
And that's purely that.
Yeah.
It's purely that connection and engagement.
How do we go about messaging that within an organization? So stepping away from the individual trainer piece, because I'm sure some of our listeners are trainers, but there'll be a lot more people that are booking training, scheduling training, paying for external trainers that you hope are going to do a good job.
Yeah.
Like there's different levels of training that we'll provide within an organization. You'll have your mandatories that you'll do whenever they're required. And then you might have some upskilling that people might choose to do. You may have some sort of professional development budget where people can go off and do their own training, whether it's postgraduate degrees, whatever. Or there might even be just a more prolonged approach to we're going to invest in this staff member, and every 3 months we give them a new ticket or a new license or a new ability, and then we second them into a role where they can practice that. Do you have any thoughts about how we go about messaging that? Because I feel like sometimes the way it's communicated is not helpful.
100%. So let me tie that back to something else we often talk about in the Presilience model, which is tribal leadership. So tribal leadership, if anybody's not familiar with the model, it's a really interesting model on performance, which essentially states there are 5 levels of performance. Stage 1, which is the lowest, stage 5, which is the highest. Stage 1 are people who think that all life sucks. I think statistically they make out roughly between like 2 to 3% of most organizations. And those people, for the most part, we don't really deal with too much. In a highly kind of unionized place like Australia, quite often it can be hard to move them on. And most of the time, organizations just kind of relegate to let's minimize and isolate them to the point where they do the least damage. I'm not going to spend too much of those because, like I said, it's 2 to 3% of people. Then we look at stage 2, and that's not all life sucks. That's just my life sucks, right? And the part of that that's often missing is my life sucks because of somebody else, right? So these are the people who, they've been there, I've done that, I've been there for 30 years. Why do I have to sit through this training? Blah, 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 blah. They've got a problem for every solution. They're negative, and issues with performance are always somebody else's problem. It could be the regulator, it could be their boss, it could be their team, it could be their partner at home, it could be whatever, but it's never their fault, right? It's always some external factor that's stopping them from performing. Now, when you're dealing with stage 2s, right, for them, everything is a pain point. So the messaging around stage 2 should really be, how do we alleviate your pain? Now, like, how do we make your life easier? We're not talking about performance. We're not talking about, mission, vision, values. And that's quite often the problem, that when we look at a lot of the messaging that organizations try to put on that, it's often tied to, mission, vision, values. That person doesn't care about that when they can't get through their workload or their email trail, or they've got some really urgent thing they're trying to fix. So the messaging around that should really be about alleviating pain. From there, we move on to stage 3s. Stage 3s are typified by the sentence, I'm great and you're not. So these are kind of like where modern managerialism has led us, where as we get closer to the top of the pyramid in the organizational hierarchy, there are less and less positions. And most of the time it's based on, how long you've been there, how good you are, and how good you are at stepping on other people. So it's very much a selfish focus. These people tend to hoard information. They take the credit for things. It's all about their performance. So if the messaging goes to somebody who's a stage 3, really the messaging around the training and education should be, this is going to make you better in area X or improve your performance in area Y. From there, we go to stage 4. And this is really when we can start talking about, vision, mission, values, those kind of things. So stage 4 is typified by the sentence or the phrase, we're great, they're not. So now we actually have an established team, an established culture where there is a common goal and a common foe. And now the messaging can really start about like how we work together to achieve something. Stage 5, very rare that companies get there and anchor there, but now it's life is great. Now we're really talking about, impacting on real change in the world, changing society, curing cancer, solving global warming, fixing COVID, whatever it is. If we're messaging at level 5 and most of our people are at stage 2 or level 2, they're not going to hear that message. So I think that's really the starting point for that, is recognizing where your people are and where your teams and culture lie on that scale and messaging appropriately.
Yeah. And look, it's such a trivial example, but even just applying that, like if you're pitching training to some stage 2s, people that maybe are a little bit depressed, they're a bit demoralized, they like to complain about things, the man is out to get them. One of the easiest ways to pitch them to come to a training session is just tell them there'll be a free lunch. Because it removes one tiny piece of pain for the day of having to eat the same lunch they eat every day. And they feel like they're getting a win because the man is paying for it. So like sometimes that's enough. And whereas if you've got someone who's a stage 3 who's like, I'm hard charging, I need to get through my workload, I need to reply to those emails, I need to get more sales, I need to do like whatever it is that person does, like a free lunch doesn't appeal to them because like I make money when I eat. Like I don't need to waste money being here. So that's not going to work for them. So maybe the narrative around the training then is about how this is going to help them achieve more. It's going to help them increase their own notoriety. It's going to give them some post nominals, whatever it is that feeds that ego. And then the stage 4s, you're selling the same training to people that are about the organization. It's about, hey, we want everyone on the same page. We want everyone to be able to work together. We want high performing teams. And by doing this, we get one step above our competitors. And all of a sudden, like that becomes more appealing. But it can start with a free lunch.
Yeah, 100%. So really all of that comes down to, we kind of talked at the beginning about the idea of trying to identify what is the behavior actually trying to change. The other thing that kind of goes along with that is what we refer to as the WIFM, right? The what's in it for me. Is that if you want somebody to take the training or education or whatever it is you're trying to do on board and be engaged, there's got to be something in it for them.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to, like I said, it could be as simple as a free lunch, but it's got to be articulated and it's got to be communicated and messaged the right way. And if you don't understand the people around you, your organization, and the culture that you have, well, you can't message that the right way.
Yeah. That's a great point, Ron, to leave it on. Really appreciate you taking the time to share some of your wisdom with us. And as I said, Ron is our General Manager of Training and Education. If you're interested in exploring any of the training and education solutions that Risk2 Solution offers, whether that's e-learning, whether it's RTO, nationally recognized training, whether it's higher education, go through Ron, but you can reach us and find out more at www.risk2solution.com. Or if you want to learn more about our Presilience courses, go to www.presilience.edu. Ron, any closing words from you?
No, just thanks very much for your time, Joe. And I hope this gives some benefit to whoever's listening.
I'm sure it will. All right. Until next time, stay presilient.